This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
Dave on the board.
So today we have to report a sad situation. In passing, we had a death on our little pocket prairie. As we came out of our program last week, there were a lot of policemen here, and coroner and others, and we have to be very understanding of that. Technically, that can be a crime scene. It was probably a homeless person who'd been sleeping there. He'd been sleeping there a little bit before I went to Iowa, came back and he was still there. An interested party on Sunday morning who comes to the prairie mainly for relaxation and the ambience of it, and he saw that the person was there and it looked like he was passed, and so he went round to a bar and got them to phone the police. So by the time we came out of our show, the police were there, and I'd been asked to identify the person, which I knew him. He was Latino. He had a wonky eye and hearing aid, and it was very hard to communicate with him because he didn't look at you. So he probably had a language problem, but he was not well, and he passed. And so it is sad because we, this week we've done a lot with discussing at city meetings and other situations the development of downtown Champaign. But always there are people who are recommending public places where people can be and enjoy, and this little pocket prairie across the road is certainly one of those places, but it also gets to be an attractive nuisance for people who do want to sleep there or do other things. One gentleman that was there at the same time took one of our Osage orange stools and burned it. Osage orange is a very dense wood, and for 20 years that stool has been there, and it's mobile, you can move them around, but he was burning it for warmth, and so he was accosted by the police, and as always when they find a body, it has to be treated as a crime scene, so it was cordoned off, and we appreciate what the police do there. I have to wonder about the process that went on. The coroner came, the coroner took details, the police took details, the crime unit came, they took GIS location so that they could recreate the crime scene if it was a crime scene, and it was hardly likely. There was not blood around and things like that. So the situation was well documented, but that took most of the half a day to do, and we appreciate that sort of concentration on one side and on one human being, and it's sad that we have to deal with that situation. To some extent, it is the difference between the haves and the have-nots. And so as we talk about development, we talk about 9-story buildings on the corner of Main and Church and Neal, and we have to figure how does that relate to further development to the north where there are low income people, and how do we balance that? It's very difficult. Champaign has been expanding at a very rapid rate. So we say farewell to that person and think about life and what it means and what happens to us. It's, you don't always expect what is going to happen. The next thing I want to talk about is TIF districts and development. There was a study session this week at the City Council meeting, and it was a long session, but I found it very interesting. The first item was Bristol Place, which is up on North Market, and it's a low-income area. It's been a little raunchy in its day, and so there's been a TIF district there that is 23 acres and probably about $7 million involved. Relocation of people and making of a park, and the boneyard runs through there. The TIF district has been running for a time, so there were questions about perhaps extending this TIF district. Let's tell you what a TIF district is. It's a tax increment financing district. It was basically set up by the federal government to allow people to take an area in a low-income site to augment it with turning the tax base for that area back in on itself for probably about 25 years. And it has morphed into more of development of any site that looks like it could be using tax reassignment for a number of years, and it has often been used for developmental purposes. The difference is often that in a big development with high-rise buildings and the like, and Champaign has been doing that, it's been gentrifying at a very rapid rate, probably at a rate greater than any other town of similar circumstances in the United States. So in that case, the tax base, when it's turned round into the increment financing district, is likely to be rather productive. So after the finish of the TIF district, the closing of it, and it can be extended if necessary, the hope is that that development will generate future tax and future income and future attraction for the community. And that's turned out to be very much the case. Local developer, Hans Grondelution, did the Hyatt house that's recently into action, and others have done things on the corner of Main and Neal Street, and they've turned out to be very successful, and that will bring more income to the city. So the gamble that the city takes when it creates a district like this is that in this case there's income base. If you go to Bristol Place, which is in a low-income place, it's not likely to turn over a lot of future income. So that's more a process of helping people who are in low-income area. So the TIF district not only has a financial base, but it has a human relations base. There's talk about perhaps expanding the Bristol Place area. It's just very close to downtown. It's between downtown and Interstate 74. But there is a corridor that comes down from a cloverleaf on 74, and it's Neal Street, and it comes right through town. It's a fairly narrow street when it gets into Champaign, so it's also an entrance corridor for Champaign. There was some real discussion about the traffic off of 74 being mainly trafficked through Lincoln Avenue, which is somewhat wider, and so football traffic that was very real yesterday was exiting on Lincoln Avenue. And you couldn't do that on Neal Street because it's a one-way street south after you get to Washington. So it's a little bit of a bottleneck here that needs attention. Over the years, it has been a mall. At one stage, the country was into creating malls, often on major drags. So Champaign spent about $1 million putting in a mall on Neal Street, and it wasn't very effective. It just didn't have that esprit de corps to make it work. And so it was taken out, which cost another $1 million. In the meantime, the traffic had to go around Neal Street, so it had to come down. Some of that traffic came down past Weft on Market Street. Some of it came down on other streets, but it bifurcated the traffic, and that was why it was taken out. But then you have to think about, if you put this traffic through town, you're going to allow everyone to come through town. They're going to go to the football game. And I've been in a number of cities where they have positively not put a ring road round the town because they wanted the traffic to come through town, and that wasn't very effective because a lot of that traffic was through traffic and it didn't really stop. So after the major traffic lanes were established for a through the city situation was complete, it was realized years later that this did not create a stopover for people who were wanting to be tourists or wanting to buy something. And sometimes the downtown was a dead central business district, so it had lost its hardware stores and its multi-use. And often there are artists and other people who would certainly use tourism, but how to attract population to the city when it is an old-style city with narrower streets and buildings that are sometimes totally removed and remodeled with a different style, or they're perhaps left historic. So there are lots of questions here, and I hope you're listening because it is important that you have input to these sorts of things, whether you be talking to council people personally, or whether you're presenting at a city meeting, or if you just ask questions and do your homework and find out what you think, because the city and the TIF district administration is always looking for your input, and sometimes it's a little sad that we don't have that input. There was quite a number of people at the study session on Tuesday, but that is not always the case. Sometimes you want to report things. At that meeting I reported on, I said thank you to the Dennis Smith, who is the physical plant director, to thank him for not mowing on Windsor Road. So that was just a little side to that meeting, just to talk to Dennis, or perhaps the police chief wasn't there because it was a study session, not a regular council meeting. But I later called the police chief because I would enjoy to have him on Weft Radio just to discuss the pros and cons of having someone pass out on a little niche which is very popular for other reasons. To thank him for the services provided, the tremendous care that was taken there. But once again, you have to know that this is on the weekend, and you can't get that sort of person to come. So then we have to try and simulate what we would discuss with the police chief, or with the physical plant director, or with the city council people. Most of our activities go on a weekday, and most of the people who would come to visit with us at Weft able to come more frequently on a weekday. And that just reminds me that the back studio, which is a backup studio, is very helpful in this situation, because you can then pre-can a program, so you can get those people who are planners or physical plant directors or constabulary to come and talk to us about the community. And these people are more friendly than you can believe. They're very tense because there's often a tension involved, but they're kind, and it takes you a little bit of get up and go to speak, because you don't always have the skills of speaking to a city council meeting. So I applaud those people who appear on the scene and drop an idea here and there, and take time to do that. And it's called politicking in some circles, and it is at the state level or the federal level too. I just wrote to Senator Durbin because I keep getting advertising materials in the dumpsters that take a rainforest of wood out of the world, and I would like to see those books turned, or catalogs turned into websites, so that they wouldn't take the rainforests down. And the number of those things that I find being thrown into the waste new is kind of sad. So just a comment there is helpful. If you are dealing with leaves, it would seem that the leaves in downtown are not collected as they are in private homes and developments outside of the city limits. So we don't have a city garbage pickup that also has a recycle pickup that includes things like composting of restaurant materials that can be developed into fertile soil. How do we do that? Well, we ask questions and perhaps do some research ourselves, and so the next thing to do is to not only go to make a complaint about, but you get to do something. You get to suggest that for instance, I went to a meeting in Iowa that dealt with trails, and we're dealing with trails, and to suggest that this community, when it goes into TIF districts, think about how people are going to come here on a bicycle, perhaps from Kankakee or Decatur or Danville or other communities. That means that you're asking your representatives to go outside of their jurisdiction, to go outside of their tenure of time. So to think 200 years or even 50 or 100 years. And that is extremely hard to do. So this week, there was an event in DeWitt County where there was a decree that the landfill that's sitting on top of an aquifer from which 850,000 people drink should not include polyvinyl chlorides. And 14 communities voted to establish that decree and request that the landfill not do that. So if you're dealing with an aquifer that crosses many counties, then you have to have some sort of organization that brings those people together to discuss that sort of policy. It happened, and it happened because some of the entities, and especially Steve Carter and his team of people, worked at it. There was some criticism that that was not enough. People wanted what was already put in the landfill taken out. But the answer there was, this is a start. We can still ask for a removal of polyvinyl chlorides and fly ash and things like that at a later date. This is an achievement. But it is also an achievement of regional planning. And if we're talking about trails, and if we're talking about coming through Urbana and Champaign with a bicycle, then we don't want people killed on the way. We don't want it to be so affluent that when it comes through a low-income area that it won't be used because it's a different style of using bicycles. If you're in the low-income area, you're probably doing a different sort of thing with your bicycle than someone who is riding across country and taking 40 days to go across country. How do we encourage our TIF district people to include hotels that have a relatively reasonable price bracket, so that the like of a ragbri that goes across Iowa can find a hotel to stay in and have friends there and to share and to know the city, to learn about the city, to have signs, to have it's just we need that regional planning, and that regional planning that I'm talking about is across many counties, many states, and across the nation. So we beg you to put your 2 cents in and think beautiful thoughts about how you can get a bicycle across Champaign without someone losing their life. That means old railroad beds often, corridors that may be across property on either side. So then you know that those people would love to buy that railroad bed so that their property was contiguous. So there is conflict and there's compromise. I'm not a very big compromiser. When you get down to the last prairie plant, then I'm not a very excited compromiser that says I'll have half a plant and you'll have half a plant for development, or you'll have half a pond and I'll have half a pond, and it doesn't read ecological sense. So there's a limit to how much you can compromise. So sometimes that results in conflict, and that results in education. So sometimes the TIF district needs to have an educational base. There is a certain amount of staff involvement here. So if we go back to Bristol Place, north on Market Street, then there's 23 acres at present, but the thought is to expand that to perhaps 120 or 130 acres, so that it includes the entrance corridor on both sides of Neal Street. So this could be upgraded as an attractive entrance way to Champaign. There are questions about what you do with the boneyard and the park that surrounds it. I have thoughts about the railroad lines there. There are 3 railroad lines, and often you have a freight train that's a mile long, and that stops traffic. So is that something that needs to be attended to? Can you have a bridge over or a bridge under that sort of site? So we leave the Bristol Place. It's in action. It is a TIF district, and houses are being removed and people are being relocated, and it's hoped that those people will come back to a upgraded Bristol Place. The next topic of discussion was 2 plots of land, and these are just north of the News Gazette building. They were the buildings on that site were removed by city planning to try and keep Sears and Penny's and other agencies downtown and not have them necessarily escape to the mall. So this is in the era when Champaign was tending to be a dead central business district. What the major site is on Washington. Let me tell you where it is. As you put a map in your mind, Washington Street goes east-west and under the railroad line. The Times Center is on the north side, so it's near to North End, lower income territory. The city has been working with the food co-op, put in a co-op just opposite Packer. The Preservation and Conservation Association is on the north side of Washington Street. Walnut is on one side, and Fremont is on the other. Penny's is being clad over, and there's the News Gazette building. It's clad over with rock brought in from Italy, actually. So it's deceiving. You don't really regard it as a pennies building, but there it is. And we have old buildings like the First National Bank, which is now a different bank, but there is this character. And the group that is wanting to buy this site for development is looking at mixed development. The leader of the push is Hans Grondelution. He's local. He's had the leadership to put up a Hyatt Regency building on the corner of Main and Church and Neal, and very, very successful. So he is asking to buy that parking lot. And these sorts of parking lots are not awfully efficient. They bring in some money, but they're costly to maintain, and they're not the most highest and best use for that land. The suggestion is that the Orpheum Theatre be retained as a historic monument. It's already a children's museum. But if you walk inside the museum, the theatre that the Orpheum was has still got a sloped floor, and it could be an auditorium for a conference group. So the suggestion is that a new children's museum that would be more efficient than the present functional reuse of a theatre could be installed, and the proposal is that it perhaps be on Walnut Street. There would be parking, and there would be a real attempt to retain the history of the Orpheum Theatre, although used for a different audience participation. There would be residency, and probably not too much higher than about 4 stories, because it would seem that that it's efficient to have your first floor with shops, and then gradually you get lower price as you go up. Sometimes higher prices are at the top because you can see out over the territory. But so there'd be a mixed use of conference, residency, and probably in there some niches of interest, some public places. Some of the real problems are that the festivals have been held in that area in a very positive way. Dave knows about that. He's been a part of WEF being at these festivals. And so where do you put the festival? David, you might say something about where you might put the festival.
Boy, I have to say that I really appreciate the number of plain old parking lots that we have in downtown Champaign. There are the parking garages too, but one of the conveniences of the open spaces that we have around here is that you can stick Blues Brews and barbecue and various other sorts of events. If you picture it, when you go over to Urbana, they ended up putting these sorts of events on the streets, like over on Main Street and Race and things like that. Originally, they put things over in the Lincoln Square parking lot, and I'm not quite sure why they stopped doing that. It seemed like an ideal place, such a large open space where everyone could see everything, and you could even have more than one stage. So yeah, listening to you describe the places and things you could do with them, it's nice to have just plain open spaces. Now, of course, the disadvantage of open spaces is they can only be used during temperate weather. What do you do when the weather gets cold like now and people aren't maybe going to want to stand outside and listen to a concert? That's when a space like you're describing, the Orpheum Theatre. Think about it. It had seats. I presume that they've taken the seats out of the Orpheum Theatre. Yes, they're not in that space.
But it's still a sloped floor.
Yeah, and then that would be really good.
And it has royal booths. I forget what you call them.
The balcony seats.
Balcony
I
seats.
used to go up there. I remember when it was actually a not first run theater. I saw quite a few movies there because they were still using it as a movie theater, and I could sit up there, and I loved those seats up there. I have fond memories. I didn't actually see the movie Star Wars there, but my favorite memories of seeing the original, now that the number 7 is coming out, was going to Waukegan and going to a great old theater, kind of like the Orpheum, and getting to hear things echo off of this huge space. So yeah, this great space that you could use. I mean, you got the Virginia Theater, which is also very nice in its way. But if you're going to have just your typical kind of a concert, I'm used to standing at concerts these days. You don't tend to go and hear rock bands and sit in a seat. It's just not done. It's for some
Well,
reason
neither
done.
Champaign or Urbana have a theater that could take 1,000 or 3,000 people. It's when you have an event, you often have small events at the various places like Iron Post or around, but there's always a feeling that there should be a major event, a keynote address, a keynote music where people can be inside, and especially, as you say, in wet weather. I have visited you at the West Mews when the rain was falling off the tent, and yes, you need to be able to handle all weathers, and also in wintertime.
The Cranard Center is a perfect example of someplace that's big and small. I mean, there's a small, tiny little studio theater that can only put a couple hundred people tops in, but then they've got the regular seated theaters, and then you can work your way up to the Great Hall, and that will easily, 1,500 people you could probably put in there between the main floor and the balcony
Yes, and you
seats.
could also go out on the street. There's a concrete seats that face onto Goodwin.
That's right, the little auditorium that they've got.
Yes,
They had
it's
quite.
outside.
Who was it? Tito Puente, when they had a Latin music festival, somebody like Tito Puente performed outside. And again, it was beautiful. It was middle of the summer. You have to count on good weather. But if you
Yes.
get the good weather, it's just an amazing way to enjoy music.
So we're encouraging you to talk to developers, and at the moment it's at the stage of that spot being bought. So there's a negotiation for the price that the city would allow. Would that be appropriate? There's has to be an area where festivals will go. So guess what? On the other side of the Orpheum, there is what used to be the Flatiron Building. You have the railroad plat, which went at a diagonal, and the Jeffersonian plat that went north, south, east, and west. So Neal Street is north, south, east, and west, but the street that is in front of the Orpheum is at an angle, leaving a space for a Flatiron Building that was taken down once again to try and provide parking for Sears, hoping that Sears would stay in town and not go to the mall. But eventually Sears and Penny's did go to the mall, and this left a sort of vacant lot. Some years ago, the city specialists suggested that this would be a good place for a farmer's market, and also some of the venues that we're talking about. But there was somewhat of a hue and cry about the loss of parking that would be there. So this is a second attempt to suggest that that area be used for venues, for farmers market, and now there is a parking lot behind north and west of the junction of Main and Neal Street. So, but there may have to be questions about where other parking could be. Could it be behind the Coons store where there are railroad yards? And Also, you have to know that if you're going to take a year or more to put a building together, you have to have somewhere to store all your equipment. Uh, you have to leave backhoes and cranes and materials in a situation that is not vulnerable but is near enough that can be used. And in the interim, where do you send your events? So that's, now we're getting to the point where Grundolution is saying, I can't put engineers and architects on a proposal plan until I know whether it's feasible to buy from the city. And the city is in agreement, so there will be more negotiations to do that. At the same time, he is willing to work with the concept of the triangle that is north of, adjacent to Neal Street, and on the north end, once again, it's Washington Street. So now there comes a request for a different sort of TIF district. It's called a fringe district. And the fringe district would take in some of these sites. And it's tentative at the moment. The staff is more or less asking the city fathers to consider whether they want to go look at a different sort of TIF district. It might eventually add up to about $95 million. It might allow different smaller groups to do interesting things. The News Gazette presented about the buildings that are across the road from us. They have moved their newspaper facilities north to the mall area, actually, or industrial area, north on Market Street. So what will happen to the buildings that are not used a lot in downtown Champaign? What does that mean to WEFT? Could you, the other things that WEFT might do if they were in a tax increment financing district, a TIF district? Already, just the other side of WEFT, to the north, there's Rubel's Blind Pig Studio, not Blind Pig, Pogo Studio is being redeveloped as a sound recording studio. So ERS, which is next door, has a kind of ugly front on it that could come out and be more like WEFT front. WEFT did a very good job of going back to an older era and kept the history. They used modern materials, but you have that feeling of an older downtown. Do you keep the history, or do you have a high-rise building go up across the road where the building has been empty for 7 years? So this proposed fringe district would include your ideas. Would you want to have ideas about Neal Street and moving traffic through? Would you want to encourage artists that really left town some when the city decided to go to 9 o'clock for paid parking, and there was not a lot of traffic? A number of artists moved to lower income neighborhoods and that was often out of town. You might go to Muhammad or Sydney or even Kelowna or Tuscola to do things. Artists don't have a lot of money, so how do you incorporate them into the city where there's a real desire to have these sorts of things? Yesterday, there was a football game, and there were cars everywhere. I came from Urbana not realizing, and I got to 4th Street. I had to go to 4th Street and down 4th Street. I couldn't continue down 4th Street. I had to go back to Lincoln Avenue. So, and it was difficult to get through. There just were cars everywhere. When I came back to downtown Champaign, there were people everywhere. So they want to find little places that are interesting. They don't. The Black Dog Saloon had people standing outside. They have a huge. This is not like Urbana where they have a fairly small building. This is a huge building, and there were still people standing outside waiting to get in. So yes, Champaign is growing, and how do we facilitate the people who come from out of town? So what do you do about the Preservation and Conservation Association? Do they lose out if this buildings creep north? Does the food co-op provide a good opportunity for people to get food? Will there be a downtown hardware store? How? Mylander has gone north into the old Illinois Power Company building and provided facilities. There's a bunch of income houses, low-income houses between the old Illinois Power Company and the Bradley Avenue. Could that be incorporated? So I get the feeling that this is a proposed TIF district, but your input is welcome. So I've got about 10 minutes. We have dealt with the landfill situation, but that has its parallels for our bicycle ways and things like that. So this week we had a copy of Rail Trails Journal that came in. We've been given some copies in advance of a national publication where we're just a part. So as a thank you for us working with the Rail to Trail movement, this is an insert which I've been giving to people. It's very good. They've done a lot of research. They've got each agency that's involved in prairie preservation and trails has a website or an email. There's a map on the second page. It leaves just a little bit to be desired, but if you're a journalist, you can't do a lot in a day. This is someone who came from the Rail to Trail national movement. She's director of communications and marketing, and she was here because we went to a conference, a Maytag conference, which I went to again just recently, and it was suggested that we did interesting things with railroad beds and trails. So could this be covered? So Elizabeth Striana came, and she picked up most of our information. The little map doesn't show the Monticello Railroad Museum, but otherwise she gets it very straight. There's a dotted area where we are dealing with an abandonment. So I took this to railroad people who are working with the possibility of sometime a historic train coming into Champaign. So if you want to think about this happening in 200 years' time, or even 50 years' time, you have to think about the land acquisition now. And so if this gets abandoned, this 3 miles from Bonneville to Seymour gets abandoned, then we won't be able to put it together again, and we'll miss that opportunity, which has tourism advantages and historical advantages, and it tells people something about the history of the railroading in this community. It lists the opportunities we have to go to Decatur, sometimes on roads that have been replaced by expressways, so there's a low volume of traffic, and you could have things like shared roads, and you see them around. Urbana has quite a few of them. Champaign has them too, with bicycles on the roadside, and you can use those streets, often designed to be not totally major drags. There are places where you can get through town or across town. It's purposefully designed with signs to say there are spots at intersections where it's a little bit on the difficult side, so there are signs to tell you how to use your bicycle and how automobiles should have regard for bicycles. So we're looking at this. So this article explains the 24 miles to Danville from Urbana, which will probably take a couple of years to put into action. But we're hoping some little parts of it will go into action soon, so we can see what it's like and then to see what it's like to have a prairie on either side, to deal with wetlands, to deal with villages that will benefit from this trail. At the opposite end, to go from Whiteheath to Clinton. And here, again, we're begging people to especially politicians, to go outside the jurisdiction and think about how Champaign-Urbana relates to Clinton or Decatur or Danville, or even further than that. There's a nice little map that I got this week from trail administrators at the national level, and it shows how you can ride your bicycle across country. Not all of it is developed for ideal bicycle way use, but the concept is there, and we want you to be a part of that concept, to ride these trails if you can, even if you only go a couple of miles. Like at Monticello, there's a Sanguine Bridge Trail where the city has acquired an easement from us, Heartland Pathways, and put in a trail and a bridge on top of a bridge so that you can get across the river and see the river and listen to the frogs in the ponds beside, and go through a little piece of the Cerro Gordo moraine and get around to Applewood, and then we're hoping for a 4 miles of nature trail, which would not be 8 feet wide, but be perhaps 4 feet wide, and maybe one direction. So, once again, I have to say that the counties that surround us, Vermilion County, DeWitt County, Piatt County, are all counties that have some terrain and interest, like Allerton Park in Piatt County, that are attractive, and there's this move afoot to try and get children especially to be a little more biodiverse. The cell phone has become monolithic, and it's not good for your brain to be so monolithic, and sometimes if you're doing games and you get to be aggressive on the cell phone, you also get to be aggressive in real life, and sometimes your biodiversity is lacking. So you may be a brilliant gaming person, but you may not be understanding the people on either side of you. How do you talk to each other? How do you have human relationships? And how does one community compete with another? For instance, if we have historic trains to come into Champaign, that's in competition with the Monticello and its Railroad Museum. How do you balance that? Okay, we're getting to the end here. I'm glad to talk to you. We appreciate the rail trail insert, and we will say this is Dave Monk of Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. And as always, the views expressed on the Prairie Monk are solely those of the speakers and no one else.